In early 2014, the heart of Kiev erupted with protest. Tens of thousands filled Maidan Square, waving blue and yellow flags through the snow. They demanded a European future and rejected the pro-Russian rule of President Yanukovych. The square burned with anger. Barricades of wood and tires were set alight. Smoke mixed with falling snow, and chants of Ukraine is Europe echoed into the night. Soon, violence took over. Molotov cocktails burst in flames. Tear gas filled the streets, and the clash of shields shook the air. Maidan had become a battlefield in the very center of the capital. Blood was spilled on frozen cobblestones. Police lines broke apart. Protesters advanced, and the world watched in disbelief. The uprising was unstoppable. Under growing pressure, President Yanukovych fled to Russia. Kiev awoke to a collapsed government. Many believed a new era was about to begin. But far from Kiev, in the south, shadows were moving. Strange soldiers appeared in Crimea. They wore no insignia, no names, only masks and weapons. Locals called them the Little Green Men. One by one, government buildings were surrounded. Checkpoints fell silently, airports and bases taken without warning. The occupation had begun before the world could react. Within weeks, Russia staged a referendum under the shadow of guns. Ballots were cast as soldiers stood watch. Fear and silence weighed heavily on every street. Soon, the Russian tricolor was raised above the Crimean parliament. The annexation was declared. Crimea was no longer Ukraine, at least not in Moscow's eyes. This was the spark that ignited a war with no end in sight. From the burning squares of Kiev to the annexation of Crimea, the fuse of one of the greatest conflicts of the 21st century had been lit. In 2015, the flames of war spread from Crimea to the industrial heart of eastern Ukraine. The cities of Donetsk and Luhansk became strongholds of armed separatists supported with weapons and men from Russia. The Donbas region turned into the new front line. Fierce battles erupted around Donetsk airport. Once a modern gateway to the world, its terminals were reduced to twisted steel and concrete rubble. Ukrainian soldiers, nicknamed the Cyborgs, held their ground for months under relentless fire. Every wall collapsed, every floor crumbled. Yet the defenders resisted, becoming a symbol of Ukrainian determination. When the airport finally fell, it was nothing but ruins. The battle moved to Debaltseve, a strategic railway hub connecting Donetsk and Luhansk. Both sides threw men and machines into the fight. Artillery thundered day and night, transforming the town into a burning wasteland. Civilians were trapped in basements, without food, without power. The streets echoed with explosions, and every passing day brought more graves to frozen ground. Amid the destruction, international mediators pushed for peace. In Minsk, Belarus, leaders from Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France gathered around a long table. Their goal: to silence the guns and prevent further bloodshed. The result was the Minsk II agreement. It promised a ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons, and a political path forward. On paper, it was fragile hope. On the ground, the war continued. Almost as soon as ink dried, artillery thunder resumed. Villages along the front lines burned, homes shattered, and soldiers fell despite the so-called truce. The ceasefire existed only in documents. In the trenches of Donbas, the war settled into a deadly rhythm. Ukrainian troops fortified positions with mud and sandbags. Across no man's land, separatist fighters waited, supplied, and reinforced by Moscow. Every night, the horizon flashed with artillery fire. Every morning, both sides counted their dead. The war had become static, yet merciless, grinding down men and cities alike. For civilians, survival meant hiding in basements, cooking over firewood, and praying for silence. Children grew up learning the sounds of incoming shells. Schools and hospitals stood empty, windows shattered by constant blasts. Ukraine rebuilt its army during these years. With Western training and new equipment, soldiers became better prepared. But Russia, too, deepened its support for the separatists, ensuring the conflict never froze entirely. The Minsk process limped on, with endless meetings and broken promises. Each side accused the other of violations, while the battlefield told the true story. Gunfire never ceased. By the end of 2015, Donbass was scarred beyond recognition. Entire neighborhoods erased, industries collapsed, families torn apart. The fragile agreement had failed, and the seeds of a much larger war were already sown. In 2015, the flames of war spread from Crimea to the industrial heart of eastern Ukraine. The cities of Donetsk and Luhansk became strongholds of armed separatists supported with weapons and men from Russia. The Donbass region turned into the new front line. Fierce battles erupted around Donetsk airport. Once a modern gateway to the world, its terminals were reduced to twisted steel and concrete rubble. Ukrainian soldiers, nicknamed the cyborgs, held their ground for months under relentless fire. Every wall collapsed, every floor crumbled. Yet the defenders resisted, becoming a symbol of Ukrainian determination. When the airport finally fell, it was nothing but ruins. The battle moved to Debaltseve, a strategic railway hub connecting Donetsk and Luhansk. Both sides threw men and machines into the fight. Artillery thundered day and night, transforming the town into a burning wasteland. Civilians were trapped in basements, without food, without power. The streets echoed with explosions, and every passing day brought more graves to frozen ground. Amid the destruction, international mediators pushed for peace. In Minsk, Belarus, leaders from Ukraine, Russia, Germany, and France gathered around a long table. Their goal: to silence the guns and prevent further bloodshed. The result was the Minsk II agreement. It promised a ceasefire, withdrawal of heavy weapons, and a political path forward. On paper, it was fragile hope. On the ground, the war continued. Almost as soon as ink dried, artillery thunder resumed. Villages along the front lines burned, homes shattered, and soldiers fell, despite the so-called truce. The ceasefire existed only in documents. In the trenches of Donbass, the war settled into a deadly rhythm. Ukrainian troops fortified positions with mud and sandbags. Across no man's land, separatist fighters waited, supplied, and reinforced by Moscow. Every night, the horizon flashed with artillery fire. Every morning, both sides counted their dead. The war had become static, yet merciless, grinding down men and cities alike. For civilians, survival meant hiding in basements, cooking over firewood, and praying for silence. Children grew up learning the sounds of incoming shells. Schools and hospitals stood empty, windows shattered by constant blasts. Ukraine rebuilt its army during these years. With Western training and new equipment, soldiers became better prepared. But Russia, too, deepened its support for the separatists, ensuring the conflict never froze entirely. The Minsk process limped on, with endless meetings and broken promises. Each side accused the other of violations, while the battlefield told the true story. Gunfire never ceased. By the end of 2015, Donbass was scarred beyond recognition. Entire neighborhoods erased, industries collapsed, families torn apart. The fragile agreement had failed, and the seeds of a much larger war were already sown. By 2021, the war in Donbass had lasted for 7 long years. The front lines barely moved, but Ukraine had changed. Its army was stronger, its people hardened. And across the border, Russia was preparing something larger. Satellite images revealed vast Russian troop movements. Columns of tanks, artillery, and armored vehicles gathered near Ukraine. What began as quiet drills soon grew into the largest military buildup since the Cold War. Along highways in Russia and Belarus, endless convoys rolled
We need
past
to ensure
frozen
that
forests.
these supply lines are
Flatbed
secure.
trains carried tanks westward, their tracks grinding over icy
We
rails.
need to confirm the coordinates.
The stage was being set for
Acknowledged.
something
Running
far
cross-reference
greater
now.
than a border skirmish. In Donbass, Ukrainian soldiers reinforced trenches, fearing the worst. Civilians stockpiled food and water, preparing for another wave of violence. Across the country, tension thickened like a storm cloud. In Kyiv, President Volodymyr Zelensky sought reassurance from allies. NATO responded with military exercises in Eastern Europe. Paratroopers trained in the snow. Tanks maneuvered through Polish fields. The message was clear: Ukraine was not alone. But for many Ukrainians, promises of support felt thin against the sight of Russian forces massing by the hundreds of thousands. Ordinary people watched the news anxiously. Smartphone screens flashed headlines. Russia moves 100,000 troops to Ukraine's border. Families debated whether to flee or stay. Western intelligence agencies warned that invasion was possible, perhaps imminent. Some analysts believed it was a bluff, a pressure tactic. Others saw the unmistakable signs of war. On the ground, Russian forces dug trenches, built camps, and stockpiled supplies. From Crimea to Belarus, the encirclement was tightening. Ukraine found itself surrounded on nearly all sides. In the Black Sea, Russian warships maneuvered aggressively. Naval drills simulated blockades, while missile systems were deployed along the coast. The message to Kyiv was unmistakable. Nowhere was safe. Inside Ukraine, the government prepared for the worst. Military reservists were called up, civilians trained in defense. Kyiv's metro stations were quietly inspected as potential bomb shelters. In Europe's capitals, leaders scrambled to negotiate. Talks in Brussels, Berlin, and Geneva sought to calm the crisis. But every meeting ended the same way. Russia demanded guarantees, the West refused. The tension was palpable on the streets of Ukraine. Shoppers filled grocery stores, stocking food and fuel. Children rehearsed evacuation drills in schools. The shadow of war hung heavy over daily life. By autumn, the buildup was undeniable. Western intelligence warned of a full-scale invasion. Ukraine braced itself, determined not to bow. Across the border, Russian troops stood ready. Engines idled, tanks lined in formation, missiles pointed west. The silence before the storm stretched into the cold winter nights. By the end of 2021, the world held its breath. Ukraine stood defiant. Russia stood poised. The question was no longer if war would come, but when. On February 24th, 2022, the quiet war turned into a storm. At dawn, missiles streaked across the sky, striking Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa. The largest invasion in Europe since World War II had begun. Columns of Russian tanks crossed the border from Belarus, aiming directly for Kiev. From Crimea, forces pushed north into Kherson. From Donbass, armored brigades surged westward. The world watched in shock as explosions lit Ukrainian cities. Windows shattered, streets filled with debris, and sirens wailed across the land. Millions faced the unthinkable, a war for survival. Civilians rushed into metro stations, transformed into bomb shelters. Families huddled together, the rumble of artillery echoing above. The modern capital of Kiev was thrown into darkness and fear. But resistance came quickly. On highways outside the capital, Ukrainian units ambushed Russian convoys. Javelin missiles struck armored columns, fire lighting the forest. The advance toward Kiev slowed. Convoys stretched for miles, stranded without fuel, harassed by drones and artillery. The plan for a swift victory was collapsing. In Kharkiv, relentless shelling turned government buildings into ruins. Yet Ukrainian defenders held their ground, fighting street by street. The city did not fall. Further south, Mariupol endured a brutal siege. Factories burned, neighborhoods crumbled, and the Azovstal plant became a fortress of last resistance. Civilians sheltered in tunnels as the city was destroyed above them. In Kherson, Russian troops seized bridges and streets, but occupation met defiance. Demonstrations filled the squares. Blue and yellow flags raised even under armed patrols. As spring arrived, Western weapons began to flow. Long-range artillery, drones, and air defense systems empowered Ukrainian counterattacks. A modern battlefield was unfolding. Night skies burned with rocket fire. HIMARS systems struck ammunition depots deep behind Russian lines. Explosions lit the horizon as supply chains faltered. By summer, Ukraine launched counter-offensives in the east. Armored columns advanced through fields, reclaiming towns abandoned by fleeing forces. The city of Kharkiv was liberated, its people cheering defenders. In Kherson, Ukrainian artillery pounded bridges across the Dnipro River. Russian troops withdrew, leaving behind wreckage and silence. The liberation marked a turning point, yet the cost was immense. Entire neighborhoods lay in ruins. Civilians carried their belongings through shattered streets, searching for safety. In Bucha and Irpin, the aftermath of occupation revealed devastation. Abandoned cars lined roads, buildings riddled with fire. The scars of invasion etched into every street. Through winter, Russia struck Ukraine's power grid. Missiles rained on energy plants, plunging cities into cold and darkness. Families lit candles, enduring nights without heat. But air defenses grew stronger. Patriot systems intercepted missiles, fiery explosions painting the sky. Each interception saved lives. Each night, a battle above the rooftops. The war became a test of endurance. Ukraine fought not only on the battlefield, but in its homes, its schools, its streets. A nation under fire, refusing to surrender. By the end of 2022, Russia announced the annexation of 4 regions. But on the ground, control was contested, battles raging for every kilometer. Maps shifted daily. Victory remained elusive. The full-scale invasion had changed everything. What was meant to be a lightning strike became a long, grinding war. Ukraine endured, the world rallied, and history was being rewritten in fire. By 2023, Ukraine was no longer only defending, it was preparing to strike back. The world waited, as spring arrived,
We have to focus our
wondering
efforts
if the
on the south front
long-anticipated
line.
counteroffensive could change the war. Across the front lines, Ukrainian forces trained with new Western weapons. Armored vehicles rumbled across open fields. Soldiers rehearsed assaults, supported by drones and precision artillery. In the east, the city of Bakhmut had become a symbol of endurance. Months of fighting turned its streets into scars of stone and steel. Drone shots revealed skeletal buildings, their windows hollow, smoke drifting slowly upward. Every block was contested, every ruin a fortress. Ukrainian defenders resisted waves of attacks while artillery shook the night skies. The battle for Bakhmut consumed thousands on both sides. Further south, Ukraine struck in Zaporizhzhia. Armored columns advanced through minefields under constant drone surveillance. Progress was slow, costly, but determined. Villages were liberated one by one. Flags were raised over battered rooftops, and civilians emerged from basements, exhausted yet relieved. The counter-offensive was carving a path forward. In Kherson, artillery echoed across the Dnipro River. Ferries carried supplies under threat of fire, while bridges lay shattered from earlier battles. The southern front remained a deadly stalemate. Ukraine's strength came not only from weapons, but from resilience. In cities far from the front, civilians endured blackouts. Generators hummed in courtyards, lights flickered back to life in cold shelters. Metro stations once again became havens. Families gathered underground, wrapped in blankets, sharing warmth through long nights of air raid sirens. Life continued, even beneath the earth. Engineers braved freezing winds to repair power lines. Their work restored light to homes, a symbol of survival against relentless strikes on infrastructure. Each repaired cable meant hope. On the battlefield, drone warfare intensified. Unmanned craft scouted enemy positions, dropped explosives, and hunted armor. The war was evolving, becoming faster, sharper, more technological. Western aid remained crucial. New tanks, long-range artillery, and training programs gave Ukraine the tools to continue pressing forward.
Just a little
But
further.
success came slowly, each kilometer earned at high cost. In Moscow, propaganda declared victory in battles still raging. But on the ground, Russian forces struggled with logistics and morale. The war was bleeding resources with no end in sight. For civilians, survival was victory. Markets reopened in liberated towns, children played near broken buildings, and farmers returned to scarred fields. Daily life resumed amid the ruins. Winter returned with waves of missile and drone strikes. Cities plunged into cold and silence. But air defenses grew sharper, intercepting many threats before they reached their targets. By the end of 2023, Ukraine had reclaimed ground, but not yet broken the stalemate. The counteroffensive showed determination, but also the heavy burden of modern war. Both nations endured heavy losses. The front lines remained scarred, landscapes pockmarked by shellfire, forests shredded by explosions. The war was far from over. 2023 proved one truth: Ukraine would not yield. Its counteroffensive was not just a military campaign, but a declaration. The nation was still standing and still fighting for its future. By 2024, the war showed no signs of ending. Instead, it grew larger, spreading beyond the front lines. Ukraine sought to strike deeper, while Russia tightened its grip on occupied lands. In the Donbass, battles raged across ruined cities. Avdiivka became the next symbol of relentless combat. Artillery thundered day and night, reducing whole districts to rubble. Bakhmut, already scarred, saw new waves of fighting. Trenches cut through fields like scars in the earth. The lines shifted slowly, every advance paid for in blood and fire. Ukraine expanded its drone campaign. Long-range strikes reached Belgorod and Kursk inside Russia. Explosions echoed across the border, showing the war could not be contained. On the Black Sea, naval drones targeted warships. Explosions rocked harbors, forcing Russia to relocate parts of its fleet. For the first time, Moscow's dominance of the sea was challenged. In Kiev, life continued under constant alerts. Air raid sirens wailed, sending millions underground. Yet markets reopened, theaters performed, and children went to school. Russia answered with barrages of missiles and drones. Power stations burned, transmission lines cut. Entire regions spent nights without electricity or heat. Still, engineers worked tirelessly. In freezing winds, they repaired pylons and substations. Each light restored was a quiet victory against despair. On the diplomatic front, the world was divided. Western nations increased aid, delivering advanced systems. But elsewhere, voices called for negotiations, fearing escalation beyond Ukraine. For soldiers on the ground, escalation meant exhaustion. Rotations shortened, casualties mounted. The war consumed men and machines faster than either side could replace them. Villages along the front changed hands multiple times. Civilians hid in cellars, planting crops in shattered fields. Life persisted, fragile but unbroken. Drone warfare intensified. From the skies, small machines swarmed over trenches, dropping explosives with precision. The battlefield was now watched from above, every move recorded. Russia dug deeper defenses, concrete bunkers, anti-tank traps, endless minefields. Ukraine's counterattacks slowed against fortified lines. Each kilometer gained was hard and costly. Despite the destruction, Ukraine pressed forward. In Zaporizhia, advances cut through fortified belts. In Kherson, artillery duels shook both sides of the river. Winter returned, bringing new hardship. Blackouts grew longer, water pumps froze, and families gathered in shelters lit only by candles. The struggle for survival was as fierce as the fighting itself. International aid became lifelines. Generators, air defenses, and winter clothing arrived in convoys. Ukraine's endurance was fueled by global solidarity. By late 2024, the war had expanded in scope and technology. Missiles, drones, artillery, and cyber warfare blurred the lines between front and rear. No place in Ukraine or in Russia's borderlands was untouched. Escalation meant more destruction, but also more resilience. Ukraine proved it could strike back, while Russia showed it would not yield. The world braced for yet another year of war. By the end of 2024, the conflict had become more than a struggle for territory. It was a test of will, of survival, of identity. Escalation had defined the year, but the outcome remained uncertain. By 2025, the war in Ukraine had lasted more than 11 years. What began in the streets of Kiev in 2014 had become a grinding conflict with no end in sight. On the front lines, battles raged in Donbass. Avdiivka, Bakhmut, and countless villages remained engulfed in fire. Every street, every trench was fought over again and again. Russia launched new offensives, hurling waves of troops and armor. Columns advanced through smoke and mud, only to be met by minefields and artillery. Once again, major assaults collapsed under heavy losses. Ukraine struck back with precision drones.
Prepare for impact.
Explosions rattled Belgorod and Kursk across the border. The war was no longer contained within Ukraine's boundaries. In Kyiv, missile alarms echoed almost daily. Civilians sought shelter in metro stations. Streets emptied under the sound of sirens. But each morning life resumed, stubbornly defiant. Drone swarms filled the skies over cities. Some were intercepted by air defenses, exploding in fiery bursts. Others slipped through, striking energy plants and factories. Engineers worked day and night to restore power. Cables stretched across frozen ground. Substations repaired under floodlights. Every spark of light was a symbol of survival. On the southern front, fighting intensified along the Dnipro River. Artillery duels shook the banks, drones hunted ferries, and neither side yielded ground. In the Black Sea, naval drones struck warships once thought untouchable. Explosions forced fleets to scatter, showing that even the sea was contested. By summer, Ukrainian forces launched new counteroffensives. Armored brigades pushed into occupied territories, reclaiming shattered villages. Each advance carried immense cost. Russia responded with waves of missiles. Kyiv, Kharkiv, and Odessa endured nights of fire and smoke. Yet air defenses grew sharper, intercepting many before impact. For civilians, life was a cycle of blackouts, repairs, and resilience. Markets reopened among ruins, schools taught in basements, and families rebuilt homes brick by brick. Diplomatic talks flickered on and off. Mediators gathered in Geneva, in Istanbul, in Beijing. But agreements collapsed as quickly as they were announced. In Moscow, the war was framed as defense of the homeland. In Kyiv, it was survival of the nation. For both, compromise remained distant. The battlefield grew more technological. Autonomous drones patrolled skies. Cyber attacks crippled communications. Satellites guided strikes with precision. The war of 2025 was unlike any Europe had seen before. Western aid continued to flow. Missile defenses, armored vehicles, and humanitarian supplies arrived in convoys. Without them, Ukraine's survival would have been far more fragile. But endurance carried a cost. Cities lay in ruins, economies shattered, families separated across borders. The war dragged on, leaving scars across generations. By autumn, major offensives stalled once more. Neither side could deliver a decisive blow. The front lines remained scarred, a frozen landscape of fire. For Ukrainians, each day was proof of survival. For Russia, each day was a gamble of resources and resolve. For the world, the war had become a defining struggle of the century. As 2025 drew to a close, the truth was clear. There was no end in sight. The war that began in Crimea had become a storm reshaping the world.